Saudi Arabia unveiled a city designed to run 170 kilometers across the harsh, beautiful, and entirely unforgiving desert landscape. A glowing blade of glass cutting straight through the sand, promising a revolutionary future, without cars, without traditional streets, and without pollution. It was presented as the ultimate triumph of human engineering, but the construction focus officially reported today is just 2.4 kilometers. Let that staggering mathematical contrast sink in for a moment. They are not building half of the original master plan right now. They are not even building 10%. They are focusing on roughly 1.4%. So what exactly happened to the other 167.6 kilometers? The obvious answer, the one currently dominating global financial headlines, is simply money. People assume the national treasury finally looked at the astronomical bill and reasonably blinked. But money may only be where the retreat became comfortably visible to the public eye, because the deeper and far more fatal problem may be the exact same thing that made the line famous in the very first place: its pure, uncompromising shape. Before financial realities could ever cut the line down to a manageable size, someone first had to logically prove that a city this shape could actually function for human beings. The true mystery is not about a sudden lack of funds. It is about a radical geometry that was perhaps destined to violently fight against human reality from the very beginning. Saudi Arabia was never trying to design a city that looked logically familiar. Familiar would never dominate global headlines. A conventional urban grid with nice parks and standard skyscrapers would never become the definitive face of a historic national transformation. To understand why this massive, wealthy country chose to trap an entire futuristic civilization inside two parallel walls, you have to look closely at the modern global tourism crisis. We are currently living in an era of unprecedented and terrifying market saturation. Following the explosive post-pandemic travel surge, the global luxury hospitality sector has hit a massive wall of financial stagnation. Recent economic data suggests that global tourism growth in traditional premium sectors has crawled to a highly concerning mere 2% annually. High net worth travelers, the exact demographic Saudi Arabia desperately wants to attract, are no longer easily impressed by infinity pools or gold leaf interiors. They can find those in Dubai or Singapore or Miami. They are completely fatigued by the ordinary. Sovereign nations are fighting brutally over a steadily shrinking pool of affluent wandering capital. Saudi Arabia recognized this shifting economic tide incredibly early. The kingdom inherently knew that to pivot their entire economy away from crude oil dependence, entering this deeply saturated market with just another cluster of five-star beachfront resorts would be an invisible and ultimately futile move. They did not need another ordinary luxury city. They needed one massive architectural image, powerful enough to announce an entirely different version of the future. They needed a calculated psychological shock to the global system. Two completely mirrored walls reaching 500 meters high and sitting only 200 meters wide, while stretching farther than many entire sovereign countries could provide exactly that precise psychological shock. The design unequivocally won. Before the city even poured its first foundation, it won absolute, undisputed global attention. It successfully won the front page of every major publication. It deliberately made every other proposed smart city on Earth look completely ordinary, safe, and ultimately outdated. But is there a fatal hidden difference between a shape that successfully sells an impossible dream and a shape that actually allows millions of ordinary people to survive daily life? Personally, I do not think the strangest part of this mega project is the extreme height. Plenty of global cities build massively upward with great success. The truly strange part, the genuinely unsettling and radical part, is forcing almost every human relationship, every spontaneous business interaction, and every mundane daily routine onto one exceptionally narrow linear spine. The line may currently be the most recognizable architectural concept never completed, but does the exact same geometry that made it so globally recognizable also maximize the exact thing modern cities are meant to destroy? Does it unintentionally maximize the isolation and physical distance between its own people? Imagine you actually live inside this giant mirrored wall. Your immediate daily life feels incredibly sleek and modern. Your closest organic supermarket may only be a very pleasant 5-minute walk away. Your immediate office space might also be wonderfully nearby. But what exactly happens when your life inevitably requires something more than the basic local necessities? What happens when your absolute best job opportunity, or your specialized university campus, or a desperately needed specialist hospital, or simply the person you deeply love and want to visit, is located dozens of kilometers further down the exact same glass wall? The line does not magically eliminate long physical journeys. It simply decides what strict, rigid direction every single long journey must relentlessly take. An independent academic study, utilizing advanced urban modeling, mapped out the full 170-kilometer city and uncovered a truly staggering mathematical reality. They found that 2 randomly selected residents living naturally inside this utopia would physically be around 57 kilometers apart on average. I want you to deeply think about that specific number. 57 kilometers. That is absolutely not a quick, spontaneous trip across a vibrant local neighborhood. That is a massive, taxing journey between entirely different metropolitan cities. The engineering answer to this sprawling problem appears aggressively obvious. You just build a train fast enough to completely crush the distance. But a high-speed rail network is only genuinely fast when it does not keep constantly stopping. If the designers use significantly fewer stations, the train stays incredibly fast and efficient. But suddenly, thousands of unfortunate residents are left stranded, brutally far from the primary transport system. If they generously add more stations across the spine, access naturally and beautifully improves. But now, the expensive train spends its entire agonizing journey constantly braking, stopping completely, and slowly accelerating again. The same independent academic model carefully estimated that at least 86 distinct transit stations would be strictly needed to keep all residents within a reasonable walking range of the network. 86 different logistical solutions, which immediately create 86 permanent structural reasons for the high-speed train to dramatically slow down. Even after aggressively optimizing the entire digital transport system, the study estimated that at least 47% of the future residents could routinely face daily internal journeys longer than 1 full hour. The line beautifully promised to permanently remove cars in order to give people their precious time back. But does physically removing private cars automatically remove the grueling psychological reality of commuting? Is this truly a car-free paradise of unprecedented freedom? Or is it a rigid, unbending environment in which one single, highly centralized transport system must perform absolutely flawlessly for millions of people to simply feel the illusion of freedom? Now imagine the dark reality of closing just one single station for emergency maintenance. In a normal, sprawling horizontal city, roads and alternative rail lines can effortlessly divert frustrated traffic around a localized failure. But where exactly does the trapped human traffic go when almost everything is rigidly and hopelessly attached to the very same narrow spine? If the main horizontal artery temporarily clogs, does the entire linear organism immediately suffer a catastrophic heart attack? And even if the futuristic train works absolutely perfectly, without a single flaw, it only moves desperate people along the horizontal plane. Their long daily journey still has another highly crucial direction to successfully travel. The hyperfast train finally arrives perfectly on time, beneath one specific towering residential module. Hundreds, or eventually tens of thousands of tired passengers leave the sleek carriages, at almost the exact same coordinated moment. But they are absolutely not home yet. They are not sitting safely at their office desks. They are only standing nervously at the absolute dark bottom of a terrifying architectural chasm. The line fundamentally removes horizontal city streets by radically stacking the entire urban experience vertically. Luxurious, quiet homes sit high above noisy corporate offices. Lush artificial parks hover directly above busy transport hubs. Vibrant schools and retail shops and dense public spaces are heavily distributed through hundreds of vertical meters of dense cold steel and reinforced concrete structure. But every single one of those isolated vertical layers must still be physically reached by a human body. Would you sincerely call a daily commute deeply convenient if the hyperfast train takes only an impressive 10 minutes, but the suffocating elevator queue at the crowded bottom transit hub takes a miserable 20? More elevators strictly require more physical hollow shafts cutting through the building. More structural shafts ruthlessly consume more highly valuable commercial floor area. Faster advanced elevators require vastly more electrical energy and infinitely more complex digital software control systems to safely prevent disastrous collisions. Furthermore, emergency movement during a massive structural crisis or fire cannot safely rely on speed alone. This is precisely why the standard elevator is not just a small, negligible mechanical detail in this grand utopian vision. It is actually a terrifying miniature version of the line itself. It is an extraordinary, breathtaking engineering solution that instantly becomes a massive, paralyzing bottleneck, the exact moment too many impatient people depend on it at once. We are therefore forced to ask a deeply uncomfortable urban question. Have we simply traded the miserable horizontal traffic jam of the old 20th century world for a terrifying vertical traffic jam of the new 21st century world? But extreme mechanical and architectural complexity is entirely survivable when you build just one glorious tower. Humanity has successfully built spectacular independent towers for well over a century. The real danger, the true existential threat to the entire Saudi masterplan, begins when you boldly and arrogantly attempt to repeat that exact same extreme complexity for 170 unbroken kilometers. A single spectacular architectural module standing alone in the desert is a brilliant, triumphant engineering project. Repeating it seamlessly and flawlessly across 170 kilometers of harsh, varied terrain is an industrial manufacturing system of utterly terrifying proportions. Every single deep concrete foundation laid into the earth must safely meet entirely different geological ground conditions. Every towering steel structure must perfectly and securely connect to the next one without a single millimeter of fatal error. Every pressurized water pipe and high-voltage power grid and complex ventilation utility must logically continue completely unbroken. Every high-speed transport system must remain flawlessly synchronized across multiple shifting desert microclimates. In a standard traditional city, a badly delayed construction site only temporarily affects one single local city block. But inside a continuous connected linear structure, every single delay is no longer safely local. It moves violently and progressively down the entire line, like a destructive wave. How many consecutive times can you successfully repeat one of the most mechanically complicated, expensive buildings ever proposed by modern humanity before a small, localized plumbing problem quietly becomes a massive national-scale logistical delay? This is exactly where the absolute brilliance of the perfect architectural rendering violently and tragically collides with stubborn human limitation. It is the one silent, unforgiving constraint that no beautiful sunlit computer-generated concept art can ever successfully hide: relentless forward-moving time. A theoretically continuous 170-kilometer linear city inherently has no obvious logical finish line. It could successfully take 50 slow years. It could take a heavily subsidized century. But a heavily publicized International World Cup stadium does undeniably have a finish line. A very brutal, very public, and entirely unmovable finish line. Saudi Arabia rapidly faced an incredibly difficult and highly dangerous strategic choice. They could proudly and stubbornly continue spreading their immense financial resources and massive labor force across a sprawling, endless city whose full, glorious completion sits safely far beyond any single understandable deadline. Or they could ruthlessly, logically concentrate their immense sovereign power on one very specific short section that the entire watching world would be strictly forced to witness. According to deeply researched recent reports from Reuters, international work was strategically and quietly refocused onto a much smaller 2.4-kilometer stretch of the empty desert, a specific stretch brilliantly planned to tightly enclose a massive futuristic glowing stadium for the global 2034 World Cup. The grand remaining phases of the ambitious original master plan would then be carefully evaluated, sometime quietly afterward. Let us be absolutely analytically clear about what this strategic shift genuinely means. This absolutely does not mean Saudi Arabia suddenly became financially bankrupt or technically unable to continue building. It simply means every single ongoing megaproject desperately competing inside the kingdom now had to suddenly fight significantly harder for restricted money and specialized workers and heavy earth-moving equipment, and most importantly, for rapidly vanishing time. But we must pause and heavily ask the most critical question of this entire grand endeavor. Did the visionary leaders of Saudi Arabia choose this specific 2.4-kilometer section because it was genuinely mathematically the best place to begin a brand new civilization? Or did they smartly choose it because it was the only isolated part of the sprawling city, armed with a global deadline, powerful enough to survive the brutal internal competition for national resources? The massive sports stadium did not merely enter the line as a pleasant architectural addition. It effectively and forcefully gave the very first section an undeniable political reason to successfully exist before the vast remainder of the desert city could even be logically justified. But strategically shrinking the highly publicized first phase does not automatically mathematically prove that the original grand idea was structurally wrong. In fact, it quietly creates a far more dangerous historical scenario. It creates the ultimate architectural test. This specific, beautifully funded 2.4-kilometer section puts the entire 170-kilometer dream on a very brutal, very public trial. If millions of wealthy people genuinely want to permanently live there in the future, if the high-speed magnetic trains and the massive complex elevators and the towering vertical public spaces successfully and seamlessly handle real human demand, if major global technology companies excitedly move their prestigious corporate headquarters inside the mirrored walls, if the colossal heavy structure can be efficiently operated smoothly without extraordinary daily intervention or massive endless financial subsidies from the state, then Saudi Arabia rightfully gains something exponentially more valuable than another beautiful award-winning marketing rendering. They permanently gain undeniable empirical evidence that their impossible future actually works. But if the significantly smaller test section severely struggles, if the internal dense logistics fail, or if the wealthy residents feel entirely trapped and suffocated rather than elevated and liberated, then the massive resulting problem absolutely cannot be blamed on the staggering original scale, because Saudi Arabia will already have smartly removed 167.6 kilometers of that oppressive scale from the mathematical equation. If a small, deeply funded 2.4-kilometer version cannot successfully logically prove the linear urban model to the watching world, who exactly will bravely step forward to fiercely argue for repeating it another 70 times across the baking desert? Official, carefully worded statements from NEOM still passionately and loudly present the line as a long-term and multi-phase development entirely logically driven by future market demand. That specific corporate statement is structurally crucial. It keeps the larger utopian vision fully culturally alive in the global public consciousness. But it also drastically, violently changes the fundamental burden of proof. Massive architectural expansion is no longer something the global viewing audience must simply politely assume will happen. It is something the very first structural phase must violently, logically, and undeniably earn. The radical pure shape beautifully creates massive physical distance. Massive physical distance logically demands terrifying mechanical speed. Terrifying mechanical speed strictly demands significantly fewer stops. Fewer public stops ruthlessly and painfully reduce ordinary human access. Adding more desperate stops completely inevitably destroys the required system speed. The fast train constantly efficiently delivers massive anxious crowds to the very bottom of the soaring module. The dense module immediately stubbornly sends those trapped crowds into narrow vertical glass elevators. Every single moving elevator deeply adds intense mechanical vulnerability and complexity. Every seamlessly repeated module violently multiplies that exact same hidden complexity. Every minor localized structural delay steadily, rapidly raises the overall national cost. Every impending, unforgiving deadline sharply, desperately reduces the actual visible section Saudi Arabia can realistically finish first. And suddenly, almost completely, in the blink of an eye, an incredibly ambitious, 170-kilometer utopian city is no longer being patiently, generously judged across 170 sweeping kilometers. It is being harshly, immediately, and violently judged inside a painfully small, mere 2.4. The line has absolutely not officially disappeared from the map. Saudi Arabia still proudly and defiantly describes it as a long-term, incredibly ambitious project, being carefully, intelligently developed in logical phases. But something incredibly fundamental has silently changed in the blowing desert sand. The original sweeping, bold vision could proudly, aggressively ask the entire world to merely imagine 170 kilometers of glorious, impossible future. The very first physical section must now desperately mathematically prove that the wild imagination actually works in harsh, bleeding reality. It must definitively, undebatably prove that a giant, imposing mirrored wall can genuinely, organically behave like a living, breathing human city. That a single, unbending, rigid spine can miraculously provide absolute human freedom rather than secretly creating desperate mechanical dependency. That extreme, breathtaking vertical density can seamlessly, beautifully create daily human convenience rather than catastrophic logistical architectural bottlenecks. And that one single, extraordinary, breathtaking architectural module can be infinitely, flawlessly repeated without multiplying every single hidden structural weakness trapped darkly inside it. Personally, I do not truly believe the line's greatest historical enemy was ever the desert heat or the shifting, unforgiving sand. The desert is entirely visually visible and mathematically understood. Its much harder and far more insidious, quiet enemy is the terrifying concept of repetition. It is the dangerous, arrogant belief that successfully, brilliantly solving an incredibly complex engineering problem just one single time magically means you can simply logically solve it the exact same way for 170 unforgiving miles. Reality did not have to brutally, deliberately destroy the line. It only had to quietly, intelligently force 170 kilometers of unprecedented human ambition to completely, permanently prove itself inside the very first 2.4. The views and analytical architectural interpretations presented in this entire video are strictly based on independent urban analysis and publicly reported financial data, including comprehensive academic studies on linear urban models. They do absolutely not represent the official corporate positions or statements of NEOM or the Saudi Arabian sovereign government. If you found this deep analytical architectural breakdown compelling, and you want to continuously explore the hidden engineering mechanics behind the world's most ambitious and controversial megaprojects, make sure to quickly subscribe and share your detailed critical thoughts in the comments directly below. Do you truly fundamentally believe the 2.4-kilometer test will successfully undeniably earn its massive future expansion? Or will it remain the solitary, lonely section of the great glass wall ever built? Let me know your definitive thoughts right now.